Welcome to the UC MBA and Executive Education Masterclass Series. Today, we're talking to CEO of Seequent, Graham Grant, about how to go into international markets. And what better person to tell us about expanding into international markets than Seequent, right? 120 different markets that you operate in, the first Kiwi unicorn. Graham, please introduce yourself and Seequent and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me on. So a quick background, I'm a multi-sector, multi-vertical career by background, and I've been in this company since 2012. So we were 40 people then in New Zealand. We're now 730 in 20 odd countries around the world. So we've grown quickly in that an 11, 12-year period of time. We're a science-based software company, so we produce software for companies to understand the underground. And there's lots of reasons why they want to do that. It might be, can I be sure my infrastructure is safe? I want to find resources. I want to know this water is safe to drink. I want to know where the water is. Where shouldn't it be? There's all sorts of reasons why you need to understand the underground. And it affects just about not only every industry in the world, it affects everything we do in life. So it's a pretty important subject. So we're science-based and we're a bit unique. We're a Canterbury spin-out, so we're not a Canterbury startup. We spun out of an existing technology company that still is here today in Canterbury. We grew organically. We had no venture funding, no angel funding, no debt funding. So we grew in our own means until later in our sort of life. And we started overseas and came back to New Zealand. So started overseas as in we started sales overseas. So we're a little of an unusual story, but the expansion to 120 markets creates a lot of lessons learned about how to internationalise. And I would say, in as much as we're known, and in New Zealand we're largely unknown, but in as much as we're known, the singularly most common question we get asked is, I'm a New Zealand company, how do I go overseas?
Exactly, and let's talk exactly about that today. And let's split it into, I suppose, three areas. First is the kind of how that all came about, the international and potentially people looking at expanding into international markets, what they need to consider as they go. And then during, so I suppose Bentley acquisition 2021 and post that, how do we manage the operations? And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned and things looking back that you would do differently.
Yep, sure.
Do you want to start us off?
Okay. Well, I guess the first question, and we're coming at this, a lot of my answers will be very tech specific, but I think they do translate across physical goods business as well. But the first question will be, why go overseas? So if you are in New Zealand and you want to go overseas, you should answer the question, why? Like, what's your goal? Most New Zealand businesses are small, very small businesses, and in world terms, micro businesses. And they'll remain that way. But we should in New Zealand be growing many large-scale international businesses, large-scale businesses, and for that to be true, they have to be international. New Zealand is a tiny market. It's almost a rounding error globally. So it's a reasonable thing to do to want to go overseas. And so the first question will be, where are you going to go? Why are you going to go there, and how are you going to go there? And maybe we should sort of unpick those things because they are very important rubric questions, because if you get it wrong, you might go out of business.
So that first one then, where do you go?
Yeah. Well, I think the most obvious thought experiment Kiwis have is, I'll go to Australia. It's just over there. They speak English, right? And we have a CER, right? So we have something of a trade relationship, and my staff can go there, pretty easily. Yeah. Sure, you need a passport, but it's pretty easy. And they can relocate there without any great difficulty. So Australia appears logical, and it may be logical, but it may not. The next experiment people normally do is say, well, it's kind of the UK for similar reasons, or it's the US. I think it's the most important thing to understand what is it about what you're doing and what problem it solves in which market before you make any decision about where you should go. For some companies, Australia would be a complete mistake. They make an assumption about Australia that they get wrong. For example, the culture is the same. Well, it's not. There are huge differences in the culture in Australia, and there are massive structural differences in the US. So I think it's a matter of really understanding, and there's a series of questions you should ask yourself about each of these markets. Things like, what's the market structure that I'm going into for my product? Do we have any evidence we've got product market fit at all? So there's product market fit to the customer, then there's market structure, which are two different things. What's the dynamics of the market landscape that we're in, competitive landscape? What if your price point's here and the local competitors are here? You know, is there local incumbency that would be incredibly hard to displace? So all those things have to be understood, as well as the logistics and regulatory issues of entering that market. So there are many, many questions that you should work through in a structured way and be very clear about what you're walking into.
How do you build that kind of market knowledge in the organisation? What do you practically do to get that knowledge?
So I think for us, early on, it was customers. So we started overseas and came back. And we started overseas because the demand for the product, or the original idea about the problem we were solving, was an overseas problem. It was mining, and we don't do much of that in New Zealand. So we were drawn into the market by some early customers, and they unpacked, the needs they had, and they were logically in certain locations. So we were in those markets by dint of the fact that we were just in them. But scaling to those markets and then deciding to put people on the ground, entities. It's worth saying that we started in 2003, and by the time I joined in 2012, there was no one overseas. So everyone was physically in New Zealand, and we were already selling, I think, at that point in 40 countries. So we were sort of an export business, if you will, and our staff just flew in, flew out, and travelled around the world. But that was not scalable, but it got us to that level of scale. To scale, we had to put footprint on the ground overseas and start to grow. And that's where many of those questions start to arise about market structure, competitiveness. You're no longer just arriving as an early entrant.
And I mean, when you go into these markets, how do you decide which entity to do and how to enter in the market?
Or whether there's an entity.
There's an entity.
So we're in 120 countries, but we have, at the time we were acquired by Bentley, we had entities in, I'll say 15. So there's a 10-to-1 country entity ratio difference, right? So entities mean, sometimes practically you need an entity to recruit people. You can't just put people in a market and not have an entity. How are you going to pay them? You've got tax issues, you've got all these things. So we assessed extremely carefully which countries we should put an entity into and how we would create that entity. So a couple of different approaches we took. First move was we established a kind of a distribution reseller setup, which we can come back to later, because channel was an incredibly important question about how you go to market. But so we chose to go to our chosen high value, high serviceable, addressable markets through a bonded reseller type model. So these were businesses that were independent, selling our product, which were dedicated to our product. They did nothing else but our product. They were branded us, the whole thing, but they were actually separate businesses. So we had a particular custom designed commercial model that incentivized them to scale really fast. But we put a ripcord in the contract that we could buy them out at any point in time. So we established those in a series of countries. So Canada, Chile, South Africa, Europe. They were the four initial ones. And we set them up in 2012, and by 2014 we'd pulled the ripcord on all of them, and we acquired them back in. So we had an acquisition mechanism. We paid them out for the enterprise value of what they'd acquired or what they'd built, and those staff came and joined us, and they became our officers in those markets. So that was one way of getting to market. So we effectively made the cost of going to market variable rather than a fixed cost of going to market. So that got us to some scale. And then with other markets, we then went through a far more rigorous selection process about why we would put an office in a given market. Like, was the addressable market there? Did it need local presence? Did it need in-language support? What were the dynamics of that market? So if I'll use an example, Brazil. So although we had a base in Santiago at that point in Chile, and we were selling throughout Latin America, there was a real resistance by Brazil to accept our software. Simple reason, I took a trip there in 2014, and the largest mining company in Brazil, which you can't do business in Brazil without doing business with this mining company, Vale, they said to us, if you don't have an entity and people on the ground, we will not buy from you. It's that simple. Got on the plane, went home, we started working on building an entity in Brazil, and now that's an unbelievably successful market. So that was a forcing device, as opposed to Russia, where it was a wholly different rubric about that market. We had to do far greater risk assessment on fraud, financial crime, sanctions. We had to think about domestic risk, staff risk, travel risk into all these places which are extremely remote. So there's a whole different lens on what the decision points were about to Russia or not to Russia, as opposed to Brazil or not Brazil as examples.
And how do you approach these risks for each market?
I think you have to think about them all fundamentally. There's some that are generalised and true, but you have to examine each of them fundamentally and separately and critically evaluate and get external input. So what's an example? So in entering Brazil, I rang every New Zealand company I could find that was working in Brazil. Gallagher as an example, work in Brazil. On the phone to Gallagher. I was on the phone to, if I recall, Tate. They didn't have presences in those markets, but they were selling into, and I wanted to know what were the issues they faced in those markets. NZTE, absolutely critical partner for any Kiwi company to go in overseas. You must talk to them, you're mad if you don't. So we would engage with the local NZTE officers and put in place a study and a plan and do a lot of research and build a picture of the market. And once we had that, then we would start dropping down levels, talking to lawyers, talking to accountants, really understanding the legislative landscape, the recruiting landscape, what are we walking into if we put people on the ground.
Massive process. How long do these take?
I would say woe to go from starting to really work hard in Russia to having an entity on the ground. It was probably 4 years.
Wow.
Brazil was probably 3.
Yeah.
I would say at least 3.
Wow.
Maybe longer. Some of them were fast because you can move quickly and get into market quite quickly. So Mexico was relatively quick. But some of these markets are just hard for all sorts of structural reasons. And if you need to go in with full visibility about the risks.
Yeah.
Right. So the employment risk structures in Brazil are completely different in Peru than they are in Chile. So we could not roll any assumption from one market to the other. You just can't.
But is that not prohibitive to SMEs in New Zealand to essentially, because those 3 or 4 years, you're carrying all the costs, spending a lot of time and effort into... And
it's management time.
Yeah.
So again, be careful what you wish for. So, it's not... This is why I think, fortunately not very often, but occasionally you get what I call the China business case syndrome, which is, oh, look how big China is if we got 1%, which of course is crazy. You should be looking at not just your serviceable addressable market, but you should be looking at the subset of the serviceable addressable market, which is actually what can we practically get to, in this market, which is way, way smaller than the TAM. Everyone talks about the TAM of this market is.
Yeah.
I'm an edtech business. Look at the size of the US edtech market. Well, that's nuts to think about a market like that. You need to boil it right down to the piece that you believe is achievable for your business at the age and stage you're at, and the channel entry strategy you've got to that market. Yeah. And usually you've got to be extremely patient. Yeah. So the costs are high, the management distraction's high. So none of this comes free and cheap. It's really hard.
Well, companies, they need to build that into the runway, right?
They do.
Consider that. And we've spoken about where, but then when? When you alluded to kind of when is also an important consideration.
It is. Yeah. So there's the spread yourself too thin risk, which is again depends on the company and what they're doing. If you're in physical goods, it's a wholly different problem again, because you're dealing with logistics. You might be dealing with parts. You might be dealing with the need for supply chain capacity in market, warehousing, all those sorts of things. Wow, the cash burn is extraordinary, which tends to push those firms towards resellers who might carry some of that risk. But in a digital business like ours, it's logistics free. Yeah. Right? So we don't carry that same kind of risk. Yeah. But it's human capital heavy. Yeah. So which and where? I think, so we were very conscious of pacing ourselves. So those first moves I mentioned were very obvious. The software had already been drawn into Chile. It had already been drawn into Australia, into South Africa, because we started in gold. That was our sort of initial kick-off, and South Africa's big on gold. We've got Anglo Gold Ashanti as an example, those sorts of organisations. So we were pulled into South Africa, pulled into Australia. So it was a no-regrets move to get going and put a footprint. If anything, it would slow the business down if we didn't, because we'd hit a scale where customers expected a presence in the market.
Yeah.
Right? They were not prepared to deal with New Zealand anymore. It's just too slow, we're too far away.
Yeah.
But when you step beyond that to actually grow a market from scratch with an entity or putting boots on the ground, that's a big decision, and you have to be extremely thoughtful about it. Yeah. So you can stretch your organisation too thin, too fast, because it's the accumulation of the risks, right? So whether you've got $0 sales or $1 million sales, you've got HR risk in a market.
Yeah.
And so you've got to balance those risks extremely carefully, and you need good advice. So we used advisors heavily, external advisors.
Yeah.
Yep.
In the market or local?
In the market.
Oh,
yep. So we used local advisors here, so tax, we used a lot of tax advice here domestically in New Zealand, and Deloitte were fantastic from that standpoint. So working out tax structuring to make sure we were dealing with all the cross-border tax issues, and having good banking relationships for foreign exchange risk and all those sorts of things. But on the advisor side, so we had there's I guess another dimension this we haven't spoken about, which is, do you expat people out of New Zealand or do you hire locally?
Yeah.
Right, that the human capital question is a vitally important question.
Okay.
So we had a very, very clear philosophy from the beginning that we wanted locals in local markets. Okay. Super clear about that. We would not expat Kiwis. I think in our entire history, I can only think of sending 3 Kiwis anywhere in the world.
Wow.
Which is unusual.
Yeah.
Most people think, Bob wants to go to America, let's send Bob to America.
Yeah.
Be amazing for Bob. But it may not be good for the business. So, we wanted Chileans in our Chilean office, we wanted Brazilians in our Brazilian office. They speak the language, know the culture, have the connections and so forth. So, but that creates a whole asymmetric risk, which is we don't understand the Brazilian marketplace, and now there's this distance between us, a greater distance between us and that market. We've no longer got Bob in Brazil.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So I searched the world for people that could be advisors, and we went and found them, and we found 5 for all of those pivotal markets, and they were absolutely key for us succeeding in those markets. And they fitted a particular pen portrait, and if I did it again, I'd do it again.
Okay.
And they were retired, largely, very senior business people, huge connections, had mana in their marketplace. Not necessarily industry expert, by the way, but they just happened to be, coincidentally. And we had to work really hard to find them. Yeah. So we were digging to find these people. They weren't on Facebook, But some of them are still with us today. And so they tend to be on, the commercial structure was an advisory role, pay you 1 day a month, pitch up, be available, help out.
Yeah.
And they fulfilled a whole set of roles which are quite soft and hard to pin down, but eyes and ears.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
They were our CCTV camera, if you like, on the ground. They were our coach of local staff, helping them deal with the fact they're now part of an international firm. They would have contacts and networks, and just as you have here, they would have networks deep within their market, and they would happily make those networks available. And they would guide us on risk. Yep.
But then, if you follow that strategy of not sending Kiwis, and especially not sending potentially people from here, how do you create the global culture, I suppose? Or is that something that you just shouldn't strive for? Oh,
you absolutely should strive for it, because you have to know who you are.
Yeah.
Right? So you cannot be a United Nations of a whole lot of additions, of a whole lot. Of course, cultures are reflective of countries, right? I get that.
Yeah.
And you're not about imposing your culture on another culture. So it's not about imposing Kiwiness on another country.
Yeah.
But there's a piece in between, which is, who are you as a firm? What do you stand for? What are your values? And that's irrespective of where you come from. Okay, there's lashings of Kiwiness in terms of how we do what we do, egalitarian, highly meritocratic in terms of how we see the world, power relations are low, all those sorts of things that I know we sort of hold that as a truism. Inversely, we see American firms imposing American culture. So there's a little bit of that flows through, but we saw that as a strength, not a weakness.
Yeah.
But you needed the folks working for you in those markets to deeply understand what this firm stood for,
yes.
not fight against it, right?
That's my major impression listening to you, is that the whole company just has a very deep understanding of your strengths, where you should go, what problems you solve for the customer.
So we've had multiple failures.
Yeah.
And they've largely been failures of culture.
Oh, wow.
So I can now tell these stories because they're long past, but I'll give you two quite extreme examples.
Yeah.
So we knew we needed to expand in Chile, and we stumbled across a Chilean working in Australia in a mine. And through connections, it's all about connections, we said, hey, come work for us. He knew our software. So we brought him to New Zealand, and he lived here for 6 months. And he soaked in the culture. He knew the product, but he soaked in the culture, figured out how we roll, and then we sent him back to Chile. And he's been there ever since. And he's the most significant cultural ambassador. He shapes the culture because he understands the way we think and the way we see the world. So that was a very powerful example. Before he ran Chile, we had a previous leader in Chile that we hired locally who had no connection to us. And we thought we did a good job, and we didn't, and it was a disaster. Overbearing, controlling, all that sort of stuff, and we had to exit this individual. Now, fortunately, we had the advisors, and the advisor told us there was a problem. We had that same problem in 1, 2, 3, 4 other markets. We hired who we thought were great local leaders, and they weren't. We had to exit those people from our business. So that was pretty painful. So we've been through lots of painful mistakes on the way through, and you learn that selection, choice, cultural alignment, the way you think about recruitment is probably one of the most fundamental things you can get right and get wrong, because it can set you back years, both with customers or staff. You can just lose great staff. So that alignment thing's really key. Now, the mistake people make is they go, oh, that's just the way people are in that market. Oh, that's just the way the Peruvians are. But that's not true, because what you're looking for people who are especially different in those markets, who are flexible and can often think the way you're trying to think, right? So they're not sort of so steeped and rigid in the way they see the world. So therefore, often finding, again, I keep using these Latin American examples, I shouldn't do that. Finding the internationalized Mexican is more important than finding a Mexican, if that makes sense. So you're searching for leaders in the market who have got an international exposure, not because they're exporting, because they're totally used to dealing with the nature of other cultures and other businesses, because it's not just home base they're talking to all these other offices around the world, and they need to be able to work together. And if you are, it's a bit like a Kiwi who's only worked in New Zealand, they have no cultural flexibility because they only know New Zealand, right? So you've got to build that cultural flexibility, and you do that by finding international locals. So we've done a lot of international local finding around the world. Not everyone, but certainly for key leaders, that is super important. So one of our key leaders in Brazil, for example, she's a lawyer by background, and she actually bizarrely came to New Zealand and studied for a year, I think either at UC or Lincoln, I can't remember, just life circumstance that sort of played that way years ago. And then she ended up working for NZTE, helping them or advising on Kiwi companies going to Brazil. And so she built this real understanding of New Zealand. We found her. Now she's still in Sao Paulo, drives a whole bunch of her business, but has this amazing global mindset, but a deep Brazilian understanding. That's very hard to find.
And an understanding of the Seequent culture.
Exactly. And advocate for. And shaping that, in a very local way.
Really interesting. We'll get to some more lessons learned and mistakes, but let's go to channel strategy. You alluded to this earlier.
So again, the story of channel is very much a function of the business you're in and the markets you're going to. Because we aren't a physical business, that rules out a whole lot of issues in relation to channel. So we made some very clear channel choices early on that I think were valid for us, but aren't necessarily translatable for other businesses. But if I talk through the choice we made, then someone else listening might go, oh, that's interesting, good for them. But we need to build the equivalent clarity for a different channel strategy. So the point is be deliberate. So we decided that we were a high customer intimacy model. We were not an operational excellence model, right? We're not digital first, we're just not doing that. Why? Science software. We're disrupting a conventional way of working by these companies, and we're introducing a completely orthogonal way of working, which is really, really hard to do when you've got decades of established practice. and a deep suspicion about, does this even work? Is it true? You know, is this AI machine telling me something that I can believe, or is it a hallucination? That's the kind of analogous problem we were up against. And you can only do that by being super close to the user, find the early advocate, and have them pull you into the market.
Yeah.
So that's why we needed to find passionate local people in local culture, fire in their eyes. They'll die on a hill convincing a customer this is the future, leave the past behind, right? Yeah. So that speaks of customer intimacy and being deeply involved. Not scalable, like for the long term, but that was our starting point. So that implied boots on the ground, or a lot of people from New Zealand flying out.
Yeah.
And so we sort of accidentally had some resellers, and then we got rid of them all and said, we're not going down that route. Now we've gone full circle, and now we've got lots of resellers for different reasons. But so I would say about that analyze very carefully the second order consequences of any channel strategy you choose to deploy. Some would see reseller as a very obvious low-cost way to go to market, and to a degree it's true. You know, you give up maybe 30% of your top line, which feels painful, but you're not incurring, potentially, a whole bunch of cost of being in market, going to market. But it's not always that simple. So if you're a small Kiwi business, which most are, then there's a decent chance you're an even smaller part of any reseller's business.
Yeah.
So why should they bother? So what often happens is the reseller will go, this is amazing, I'd love to have your product. Fantastic. Won't guarantee you anything. Put it on the shelf. We represent XYZ company. How good are we? But nothing gets sold. So you've got to be very, very deliberate and very careful. If you choose to go down the reseller strategy, which we did in some markets, then you have to design your operating model to make that reseller channel work. You have to enable it. You've got to support it. You've got to build long-term strategy. You've got to partner with that reseller. You've got to convince them to sell your thing and not the other thing.
Yeah.
It's not just about price.
Yeah.
And you need to be prepared to go the long term.
Well, so it sounds like you don't have a kind of one-size-fits-all to all the markets channel strategy.
We're now multiple channels. So many years on, we've got many channels to market. But we started high customer intimacy and then started to move back to some degree of operational excellence as time went on.
So interesting. So that starting point, high customer intimacy, what does that look like in this market? And we make that happen.
And it's expensive.
Yeah.
Super expensive. Because if you want to be intimate with a customer that's in Iceland and you're here, you're on a plane.
Yeah.
And that just burns cash. So again, patience, being willing to grow. And again, this all depends on the nature of the business, right? Are you fast venture funded? Are you going quick? Are you zipping through the valley of death and planning to come out and be super amazing? Or are you a low, slow grow, organically driven business? It all depends.
Yeah.
You got to work within your means. In our case, we chose the low, slow grow, fund ourselves model. We had no pump primer funding our business. We had to pay for our own way.
Well, if you look back on it, I mean, it did grow pretty quickly. If you think about just the past decade, you describe it as low and slow, but actually, I mean, what you guys have achieved is amazing.
Yeah, but that was product market fit, right? So you're selling something people actually want. So in this case, and it took us, remember, 10 years to go across the chasm.
Yeah.
So for the first 10 years, we were in the early adopter stage, and competitors hadn't really treated us as anything serious, and we were slowly establishing an understanding of this way of working. And then we flipped over the chasm through a series of moves, and then sort of away it went. Yeah. And that was all a self-funded journey.
Yeah.
Ran a low profit model, like profit margins, EBIT margins were really, really thin, and we spent everything we earned and away it went. And then the inflection of EBIT only really happened at year, I would say 14, 15, which is typical SaaS software, right? Suddenly the margins widen as you grow because you've got recurring revenue. So again, that's unique to a recurring revenue software business.
Well, you talk about this chasm, right? So as you grew as a business, did you find that your leadership style had to change, potentially massive organizational structure changes as the company grew, kind of in big increments? Yeah.
Well, I think so again, we were a micro business. We are still a relatively small business. I mean, let's put it in global terms. 700 people is a small business globally. It might be big for New Zealand, but it's small overseas. So the journey from there to here is continuous evolution and change. There's no there were periods of quieter evolution and then points of revolution, from a structure standpoint and business model standpoint, but I would say it was continuous evolution and evolving all the time. So to enable that, you needed a team, a business that is somewhat open to the idea of change and expecting that it's just the norm, that it's not long period of stability, restructure. We've just never done that.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, to your point about leadership style and so forth, of course, you're folding into that the obvious sequences of changes. You go through thresholds of size, you need to put management layers in, you then create generalists to specialists. You can't justify having a brand marketer in your business when you're tiny.
Yeah.
You can't do without one when you're larger. So you hit those inflection points where you say, now it's time to specialise. Yeah. We need to bring in the domain expert in this space. So there's all those sorts of evolutions, but that's continuous, and there's hundreds and hundreds of those micro moves as you go along.
That must have been an interesting evolution where you essentially just had a bunch of geologists in the company, and then all of a sudden, and they were doing some of the other stuff as well, and then all of a sudden you potentially had brand marketers or specialists who did not come from the industry.
That's right.
How did you navigate that change?
Well, I guess in a general sense, it's being very careful who you hire. So generally speaking, you're looking for people who are adaptable, who can turn their hand to things, that can understand the stage of the business you're in. So sometimes you're hiring people to be a generalist because you've only got one of them and they need to do 6 things. But they need to accept that as you get bigger and bigger, that their 6 might become 3 and they've got to shed 3 to someone else. And so you need people who can roll with that change. That's very, very important. And I would say as we went, so as well as folding in specific domain expertise, as we've gone on and built scale, and the inflection of change gets more difficult, more complex, more risky, that we've had to focus more on hiring ahead of where we are. And that's become very much a way of working. So if we're doing something in a given space, we will hire someone who's the person who's 4 years ahead of us already, been there, is not frightened by where we're trying to go, but can pull us there as opposed to having to ride with us and hope for the best. So the idea of hiring forward is a really, really important idea, and that's very much standard in our mode of working now.
Wow.
But I think to hire forward, you've again got to judge where you are. Are you baby, toddler, teenager, where are you? And if you're a small business, you can't always do that. You can't afford to do that. That's too expensive.
Yeah.
So you've got to get who you can get, help them grow to a stage, but accept that you'll probably either grow past them or they'll grow with you or their job will change, but you've got this continual evolution the whole time.
So lessons learned. You've already spoken about one. Any other lessons, mistakes, looking back, stuff that you would do differently?
On the going market thing, I think there's one. I would say there's one important thing that wasn't a mistake. Well, we've seen this mistake made many times because we've acquired a lot of companies, right? So in acquiring companies, you absorb their mistakes. And I'm not saying we got everything right. We had loads of mistakes. But one of the classic mistakes that software companies make and tech companies make, and it happens all the time, is in their urgency to grow in a market and get pulled in by the next big customer or whatever, is they then focus their attention on that one customer and don't think about building something that's scalable. So they customize. So in the tech world, that's feasible in certain parts of the tech market, but it's extremely dangerous in others. Because the moment you build something specific for somebody, you'll be carrying that legacy for life. Yeah. And that's a huge tax on the organisation. So we decided day one we would never customise anything, ever. Wow. To which a lot of customers didn't like that and chose not to go with us. Even down to being slightly software about it, in our world, which is quite sciencey, you can't script anything. So you can't work inside the software and write what you might think of as a macro. Every one of our competitors did that. And we said that's precisely the thing we won't do. Because all they're doing is layering up customer-led customization around the software, which at some point will break. And it will slow them down. So we said if we don't do that, we won't get slowed down. And we didn't slow down. So I think that's an example of being very, very clear about something. We acquired a business that had pursued one really large US government client, and had gone down this route of deep interest in that customer and building something just specially for them, highly customized for them, and never stopped to think what's the second order and third order consequences of this decision.
Yeah.
And obvious things when you look in from the outside, like how much resources it's consuming that can't be used anywhere else because it's dedicated to that. The moment you take the resource away, you've got your largest client going, what are you doing?
Yep.
No measure of profitability, and in fact it was losing money, so we killed it when we bought that business.
Wow.
And so that, you know, those mistakes are very easily made, and it's often made in the heat of needing the cash. It's so exciting. Big customer pays big check, you know.
Yep.
That's one lesson. I think the other one, we made this misstep a couple of times, but fortunately didn't go too deep, which was services versus recurring revenue. You know, are you building a business that's got an innately high quality revenue, or is it a service-led business? Most of our competitors or others in the market chose a service-led or at least a highly service-supported business, and the problem is that incurs massive cash cost in their business. So we designed a business that did not require services, which meant that all of our resources could be poured into product, can be poured into high-quality recurring revenue.
How are you a customer-intimate business with a product focus and not a big service focus? That's really interesting.
Yeah, so I think that's then down to product design,
Yeah.
right? So how adaptable is your product? How adoptable is your product, not how adaptable is your product? So I think we were working within a domain space that enabled us to build something that could be more usable out of the box than required customizations. We didn't want to customize in any way, shape or form. And if it's transformative and it does something unique and it does something new, then there's a willingness to adopt. And it was a mode of product design which was different than perhaps had been there in the past. But that's the benefit of coming in from the outside. Yeah. Right. We weren't growing up from within the industry. We were coming in laterally from the outside.
Yeah, and disrupting, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Well, I love your comment about customization. When I teach my digital transformation course, I always talk about the perils of customization, and just think about where it's going to put you 10 years down the line.
It's a complete fool's errand. And now there's configuration, which is different, which is more of an enterprise-based. Now, remember, we're not enterprise software.
Yeah.
So we don't even really do configuration.
Yeah.
It's a usable product that you can deploy in many different ways without the need to configure.
Yeah.
That's the best way to think about it.
Well, to me, it again speaks to a really deep understanding of what the problem is that you're solving and confidence in the company, what you stand for, the product that you're taking to market. Yep. And that's a key message that I'm taking away from today, but also a real focus on talent, not only here in New Zealand, but also talent and people in those markets that you go to, and a real focus on building the right kind of people to lead those organizations. Yeah,
I mean, if you think of any of your country offices around the world, have you got the A-team? That's what you want to know.
Yeah.
An A-team isn't a bunch of high-performing individualists. You know, it's the second word that matters, not the first, right? So to what degree are they team? Are they high-performing as a team?
Yeah.
Are they integrated? Are they supporting each other? There's many other things we did from a people and culture standpoint, everything from your remuneration, for example. We had a completely contrary remuneration model to almost all of the rest of the industry, designed to get that outcome, which was a highly integrated team working together, passionate about an outcome, focused on transforming and working with customers and building high levels of respect with a customer two-way, which ultimately you can see in NPS, which is extremely high.
Amazing. And one final thought, I suppose, Graham, if somebody was thinking about this, they have done nothing, what is the first thing that they need to do tomorrow?
Get a governance team.
Okay.
Yeah. So this, if you're going into a market to do something, it's a project.
Yeah.
Right? It's a project that in some ways may not have an end date, but it certainly has a series of gates that you need to be super careful about. So, you don't want to make a one-way door. If you know that term, you don't want to make a one-way door decision into a market and find you've then got to back out.
Yep.
One of our competitors went off into two markets that we never wanted to go into until much later in the piece. So they chose to go hard after China and hard after Russia. So we latterly went to Russia. We never went to China. All sorts of reasons for that, but I was dead against going to China. And so they went to China, put a huge amount of organisational effort into that particular market, and then down the track, for all sorts of reasons, had to back out and leave the market. They'll never go back. Those markets have long memories, right? So, you need to be extremely careful about the decisions you make where you choose to place your feet in a marketplace. So again, it's about putting a project team together, getting governance, getting it sponsored by at least someone on the executive team, and putting real structure and discipline and rigour into the project of how you're going to think about this market. Because I guess what I'm trying to emphasise is that these are really, really serious decisions. Not one to be scared away from, but do not go into them lightly. Yeah. You could kill your company.
Yeah.
And so, depending on the situation and what it is. So for us, as I said, in some markets, we were drawn into the point where going was really easy, like setting up in Canada, no problem. We had lots of customers that were super excited, early adopters that were pulling us in. So it was just quite mechanical to get an entity, get things set up, get an office, and away we go. The decision to go into Russia was a very, very slow and thoughtful decision, because we were balancing, for example, Kazakhstan versus Russia, because really it's the CIS. This is way, many years before the war started. And we had to make a key decision. Was it going to be Kazakhstan or Russia? Like that, we angst over that decision for a long time.
Yeah.
So again, governance, advice, pulling in externals, NCT is your friend, getting them deep inside the team, all those sorts of things, and then having exit points and gate points all the way through. So when you make those decisions, you're not only making the decision at that point in time, but you know what you're walking into and you're prepared to back it, because these are long-term moves. Yeah.
I love it. Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you for your time.
That's okay.